Alright, now we begin our segment Generations Reflecting on Lifestyles. And today I'm going to be reacting to a video of our friend Jack Morgan called How Millennials Were Completely Brainwashed. And it's really interesting because it touches on something many people from the millennial generation quietly begin realizing once they reach their mid 30s or 40s. So let's hear a few seconds of the video and I'll start commenting about the entire content.
Yeah. Anyways, buckle up. This one's titled How Millennials Were Brainwashed. I actually started watching some of this, and this guy basically nails it. So if you're between 30 and 40, let's party.
So in this video, I will be discussing some of the conditioning and programming that went into the millennial generation. Now, when I mean millennial, I mean the general understanding of what that age group is. And essentially, it's people born within the early 80s to the mid 90s. Now, there is some debate as to the exact date, but let's just keep it at that. So, what is it about us millennials that brings out the worst in so many other generations when discussing us? Well, let's go back a bit. Let's kind of look at how we have been programmed, how we have been conditioned.
Promiscuous girl, whatever you are.
Don't you wish your girlfriend was a freak like me?
I got so brave, drinking and lost my discretion.
There was the hottest song in the world called I Kissed a Girl and I Liked It. That's the best, dude. Nowadays, it would be a guy singing it. And it'd be I kissed a boy and I like no gay. Everyone's gay. I think that's a big one. I think the millennials, I don't want to go too crazy here, okay? Gay is good. I'm not talking like that. But just imagine for a second. Think about all the OGs, the godfathers of the gay community, right? Now, sir, think about
Alright, you can check it out the full video on his channel. Subscribe to Jack Morgan's channel. I will leave it in the description, the link. And the central idea of this video is basically this, that millennials were heavily shaped, maybe even conditioned, by the media environment of the late 90s and early 2000s. As they were showing in this excerpt of musical video clips being thrown at millennials. And whether people agree completely or not, there's definitely something interesting about revisiting how powerful centralized media used to be. Because younger generations today grew up with YouTube, TikTok, streaming, algorithms, infinite personalization. But millennials largely grew up inside a media bottleneck. That meaning MTV, mainstream radio, Hollywood movies, magazines, and a relatively small number of cultural gatekeepers. So millions of teenagers were often consuming the same emotional programming simultaneously. And one thing Jack Morgan says that I found very interesting in his video is this idea that media almost provided young men with pre-made personalities. The frat boy, the stoner, the rebellious bad boy, the hypersexualized party identity. And if you revisit many late 90s and early 2000s movies now, you can absolutely see this. Movies constantly told young people partying equals freedom, alcoholism equals fun, emotionally immaturity equals masculinity, and casual self distraction equals social success. And importantly, this was not only happening in movies, it was music videos, radio culture, MTV reality shows, college comedies, advertising. It was an entire atmosphere. And when you revisit that era now, it's kind of amazing how aggressively hedonistic mainstream youth culture became, especially during the late 90s and early 2000s. What's interesting is comparing this to the 80s, right? Because the 80s also had consumerism, party culture, and materialism and excess in some way. But culturally, the 80s still maintained more separation between adult life, teen life, and childhood. Meanwhile, by the late 90s and especially the early 2000s, adult themes became much more directly injected into younger ages. And Jacques' example about elementary school kids already listening to explicit rap lyrics or sexualized music is not as exaggerated. That genuinely happened. And many parents had no idea how rapidly media culture was changing. Now, one phrase from the video that really stayed in my mind was when Jack described school dances as bar simulations. And honestly, that's a surprisingly accurate observation because many young teenagers were basically rehearsing adult nightlife culture before emotionally understanding it. With music, sexual pressure, alcohol culture, status competition, hypersexualized identity, and meanwhile, many kids were still emotionally children. And this is where I think millennials experienced a very strange contradiction. Because on one hand, they were exposed to adult themes earlier than previous generations, but emotionally, many still lacked guidance about identity, relationships, and meaning. Now, comparing this to Gen X and Boomers, there are similarities but also important differences. Boomers grew up in a world with much stronger social structure and community life. In their times, there were more churches, more neighborhood identity, more face to face interaction, more stable routines. Now, of course, many boomers rebelled massively during the 60s and 70s, but the structure itself still existed. Meanwhile, Gen X often grew up with divorce, economic uncertainty, latchkey childhoods, and a much more cynical atmosphere. And Gen X culture often reflected emotional detachment and distrust. You can feel it in grunge, alternative rock, independent cinema, but millennials experienced something slightly different. They inherited consumerism, digital transition, hypermedia, and increasingly artificial identity culture. And perhaps that's why many millennials now describe feeling psychologically fragmented, socially exhausted, or unsure which parts of themselves are genuinely their personality. And then, in another part of the video, Jack brings up another major point, that is the smartphone era. And this may be one of the biggest psychological shifts in modern history, because previous generations still separated technology, social life, music, dating, gaming, photography, I don't know, many things. And all these experiences existed in different objects and places. You had CD players, telephones, cameras, video stores, arcades, concerts, shopping malls, but eventually everything collapsed into one device. And something emotionally changed after that. People stopped gathering physically as much, like in the malls or in big gatherings, and dating changed, parties changed, attention spans changed, friendships changed, and maybe most importantly, people stopped being bored together. Now, another interesting idea in the video is this feeling many millennials have that the party ended, that the culture promised freedom, constant excitement, pleasure, and endless youth. But eventually, many people reached adulthood feeling isolated, financially stressed, emotionally confused, and disconnected. And I think many millennials now are re-evaluating the values they inherited, not necessarily rejecting fun, but questioning whether endless stimulation actually creates happiness. And that question feels very relevant today. Now, at the same time, I also think it's important not to become overly cynical, because every generation was shaped by media in some way, right? Boomers had television, Gen X had MTV, millennials had centralized pop culture, and Gen Z has algorithms and infinite scrolling. The forms change, but the struggle to preserve individuality remains. And one healthy thing people can do now is becoming more conscious about what influences them, what values they absorb, and whether they are actually living according to their own principles. And strangely enough, one advantage people have today is awareness. Many adults now are genuinely questioning consumerism, hyperstimulation, social media addiction, and performative identity. And that self awareness itself can become the beginning, at least, of a healthier direction. So maybe the most important takeaway from tonight's video by Jack Morgan is this. Human beings are deeply shaped by cultural atmosphere, whether it's music, movies, through television, social pressure, technology. All of it affects identity more than people sometimes realize. But eventually, adulthood also gives people an opportunity to consciously decide which values, habits, and ways of living they actually want to keep. And maybe that's one reason so many adults emotionally revisit the 80s and 90s now. Not because those decades were perfect, but because looking backward sometimes helps people understand what changed and what parts of themselves they still want to preserve moving forward. All right, everyone. Thank you for listening to our segment Generations Reflecting about lifestyles. And coming up next, we have our segment Tools for These Times. in which I will give you some psychological, practical tools to sort out, solve, or at least cope better with some psychological issues from modern times.